What will be Luffy's next power? With years left before the endgame and the battle against Himu to go, Oda has to shock us with new abilities to break the monotony. And today, you're going to discover exactly what he's planning. Luffy has awakened his Zoan fruit, granting him a brand new transformation. Our protagonist called this form Gear 5th. According to him, this is his peak. This implies it's the final form and there won't be a Gear 6th. But is this 100% confirmation? Not at all. If Oda wants a Gear 6th, he can absolutely do it. Nothing is stopping him. In fact, this is a shonen manga. I'm confident investors are already pressuring him behind the scenes. They want a new form just to drive up merchandise sales. Right now, Gear 5th feels relatively fresh, but this manga progresses very slowly, with few chapters per year. If Oda decides against a new gear, we will spend nearly a decade stuck with Gear 5th until the story ends. Look at the timeline. We first saw Gear 4th back in 2015. 7 years passed before Gear 5th debuted. However, to keep the hype alive, Oda gave Gear 4th multiple variations. Beyond the base form in Dressrosa, Whole Cake Island gave us both Tankman and Snakeman. Considering this, it's hard to believe Oda won't surprise us with new forms for Luffy before One Piece reaches its endgame, perhaps around 2030. This is simply too many years. Shueisha and the investors will soon start getting anxious, pressuring Oda to showcase epic new forms to recapture the fans' attention and keep the revenue flowing. Oda would be in a dilemma, because narratively speaking, he doesn't really need to do it, at least when it comes to a brand new gear. It's true that Luffy's Zoan fruit is incredibly unique, given that we haven't seen the traditional 3 basic forms prior to his awakening. But this is simply because it's the Zoan of a rubber human, and since he's already human, his human, hybrid, and beast forms are essentially identical. The only thing that truly transforms his appearance is his awakening, which brings him closer to the image of a deity. If Oda had no choice but to give in to investors' pressure to create a new gear, his only real loophole could be to introduce an awakened beast form. This would mean pushing Luffy's appearance a bit closer to Sun Wukong or Hanuman, giving him a more monkey-like aesthetic, quite similar to what happens with Goku. But for this to make sense, the legend of the Warrior of Liberation would need to state that besides being a rubber human, the Sun God also possessed the power to take on a beast-like form. Since the Zoan fruit is rooted in a specific mythology, it would naturally inherit that transformation as well. In fact, Oda has already foreshadowed this one, more or less. If we look at the original concept art for Gear 5th, we can see that in one of his early sketches, Oda was already playing around with a design that made Luffy look much more like a Monkey King. However, there is absolutely no need to classify this transformation as Gear 6th. It could simply remain part of Gear 5th. The thing is, the unique trait of Gear 5th is its ability to take on any shape that user imagines. We've already seen Luffy turn giant, deflated, muscular, and various other forms. Yet Luffy doesn't label each of these shapes with a specific title like Boundman, Tankman, or Snakeman. Here, these forms fluctuate during battle. They are in constant flux and don't require distinct names. Since the core power of this gear relies entirely on imagination, Luffy still has massive untapped potential. He can explore this form much farther and develop new techniques. It is already a widely accepted fact that Gear 5th is heavily based on what is commonly known as Toon Force. In other words, is that fictional cartoon power that allows characters to defy logic and physics purely for comedic effect. The key difference is that in One Piece, this power actually exists and has an in-universe justification. Think about it. In Looney Tunes, If Bugs Bunny pulls a massive mallet out of a thin air to hit someone, there is no narrative explanation for it. It's just a visual gag required by the scene. In Luffy's case, he doesn't just possess Toon Force for the sake of it. He has a devil fruit literally rooted in that cartoon concept. He actually has a lore justification to wield that power. In the exact same way, Cracker has a justification to magically conjure biscuits because his fruit is based on the concept of biscuits. By having an actual in-universe explanation, Luffy's power is slightly more constrained. However, we will never truly know where the boundary lies, giving Oda ultimate narrative flexibility. One thing that is absolutely clear to me regarding the limit of Luffy's power is the concept of humor. Luffy's so-called Toon Force only functions if whatever he imagines serves a comedic purpose, meaning it has to create a funny scene for us, the audience. Another perfect example of this in-universe justification is when Oda confirmed that Luffy pulled those sunglasses and later that packet of paint from a dimensional plane called the Nika fantasy world. In other words, inside the world of One Piece, there is an actual explanation for conjuring objects out of thin air. Luffy's fruit allows him to imagine an object and manifest it directly from this Nika fantasy realm. By contrast, Bugs Bunny isn't pulling things from another dimension. It's simply an intentional plot hole that is completely overlooked just to keep the scene entertaining. In conclusion, Luffy doesn't actually possess Toon Force. He possesses a devil fruit rooted in the concept of Toon Force, granting him a vast array of abilities, as many as his own imagination allows. And keeping this in mind, this is precisely when we can question whether Luffy's Red Hawk was truly caused by rubber friction, or if Luffy was simply convinced in his own imagination that it could happen by mimicking Ace. Let's remember that besides being a fruit with powers inspired by cartoons, it's also the fruit of the Sun God, which could easily serve as a justification to grant him fire-based abilities. If we are ultimately heading toward a battle of God versus the devil, or sun versus darkness, it only makes sense for fire to be a crucial element in our protagonist's power-up toolkit. And this leads me to believe that there is a perfect window here to introduce a new form, an opportunity for Oda to satisfy Shueisha and showcase a much more striking transformation for Luffy. It could be pretty close to how we all initially pictured Gear 5th before it was animated, with his hair literally looking like blazing flames. Oda has actually played with this concept in two distinct color spreads. On one hand, we have a Gear 4th Luffy where the Hagoromo surrounding him, the vapor ribbon typical of Eastern deities, is entirely made of fire. On the other hand, we have a color spread from right before Gear 5th where Oda drew the Straw Hats inspired by video game characters. That specific Luffy already had the signature Nika hairstyle, but it was made of pure fire, and his fists were completely engulfed in flames as well. Oda could incorporate this concept into the definitive form of Nika. Luffy would transition from his base Nika form into a sun form, something quite similar to the image you are seeing on screen right now, though I'm sure Oda will draw it looking far more epic. Perhaps the fire on his arms will be etched into his skin, similar to the Haki spirals we see on Snake Man. But as I said, all of this would simply be to satisfy the publisher and those fans who just want a traditional battle shonen where the protagonist gets a progressively more epic transformation. The truth is, Oda has already reminded us multiple times that Haki is what truly matters. We've seen a mere glimpse of Joy Boy's Haki, and Luffy must reach that level for his final battle. We already know that in Elbaf, his main power-up will be refining his Conqueror's Haki, utilizing it in a way that can bypass or negate the regeneration of the Holy Knights, and naturally, Imu as well. That being said, I'm completely certain we will see brand new comedic gags born from Luffy's imagination in his Nika form. And specifically, there is one particular ability that I'm quite convinced we're going to witness. Something highly practical that we could actually consider a genuine new technique. rather than just a simple visual gag. I'm not entirely sure whether he will deploy this against Emu or Blackbird, but I know Oda will make it happen at some point in the story, and it is directly inspired by Sun Wukong's most famous technique. Sun Wukong could pluck hairs from his own body and transform them not just into random objects, but into exact clones of himself. As we established earlier, Oda has already given us a first nod to this by having Luffy pull items like sunglasses straight out of his hair. But the logical next step will be replicating the very technique he had to face against Kizaru back in Egghead. That Logia user could manifest clones made of pure light, and Luffy will almost certainly draw inspiration from that to conjure his own duplicates. By doing this, Oda would perfectly homage one of Sun Wukong's most iconic abilities, which is ideal for distracting enemies or evading direct assaults. Historically, the main vulnerability opponents exploit whenever Luffy shines with a new transformation is keeping him at a distance, overwhelming him with multiple angle attacks to drain his stamina. For instance, Doflamingo knew that a single clean hit from Gear 4th Luffy could utterly crush him, which is why he constantly utilized his awakening to assault him with strings from every conceivable angle. We witnessed the exact same strategy with Kizaru, but if Luffy learns his lesson and manages to create clones of himself, they would effectively neutralize those multi-directional strikes, allowing the real Luffy to focus entirely on closing the gap with his actual opponent. Luffy consistently adapts and learns from the techniques of his past rivals, so I don't think it's a coincidence that Kizaru used light clones against him. Oda was cooking, just you wait. And that's it for today's theory. By the way, if you're still here, thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community of theorists. Your support is what keeps this channel going. But before you go, I want to know your thoughts. Do you think Oda will actually give in to Shueisha and the investor just to sell more merch? Or will he stand his ground and focus purely on Luffy's haki? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.